Fellas, UFC 300 is the greatest card of all time, or at least it is on paper. It's definitely the most stacked card we've ever had, and maybe you might be disappointed about the main event, or you might be disappointed about a few fights on the card, but undoubtedly, this is the greatest card of all time, at least on paper, and I don't even think it's going to perform badly as well. You look at the fighters on this card, it's just bound to be insane. So I'm going to be explaining why UFC 300, at least in my opinion, is the greatest card of all time. Starting off, first of all, there's 12 current and former champions on this card. I mean, to have that much champions, former and current, on one card is insane. First of all, it says that there's a lot of champion level competition. Just because they're not holding a belt doesn't mean that they're necessarily, you know, decreased in performances. I mean, we've got guys like Yuri Prohaska and Sterling on the card, and Figueiredo, and a lot of these former champions that, you know, they're not even champions that have from like years ago. I mean, there's a few, but most of the former champions on this card are fairly recent, and they've only recently lost their belt. So I feel like even the fact that there's so much champion level competition on this card just shows how good it is, and the fact that it's the highest competition card you're going to get. And then I found out another statistic that 10.81% of all UFC champions in UFC history are on UFC 300. I didn't believe it either when I first heard it, but that's just an insane stat that over 10% of all UFC champions are on this one card, packed into one card. It's basically every fight, even though there's not technically not a belt. It feels like nearly every single fight is a title fight, just because there's so many champions on this card. So that's the first reason. The amount of champions and former champions on this card is just insane. And talking of champions, there's 3 title fights on this card as well. Now, I know this isn't the first card to have 3 title fights. I'm pretty sure UFC 261 and 259 and a lot of pay-per-views before that had 3 title fights, so it's not the first time, but I mean, first of all, the card's going to go on for a lot longer. I mean, you can't really complain. Unless it's like a Rose Namajunas versus Carla Esparza type of fight, you can't really complain. And I don't think those are going to be the fights on this card, considering the fights we've got. But 3 title fights on one card, it's always good when we have that many title fights. So yeah, the fact that we've got 3 title fights, and even though one of them might be a female title fight, it's Zhang Weili. I'd much rather have Zhang Weili than, I don't know, any of the other like female title fighters on there. So the fact that it's Zhang Weili, I'm glad that it's her. And then we've got Gaethje and Holloway and Pereira and Hill. Yeah, 3 insane title fights, and I think they're going to be bangers as well. It's not even like the title fights are boring. They're all going to be bangers. I mean, first of all, Justin Gaethje versus Max Holloway. Say what you want. Say that you might think that Holloway is going to get squashed, but at the end of the day, Justin Gaethje versus Max Holloway, it's going to be a bloody war. Whether it finishes early or whatever you think, Justin Gaethje, one of the most exciting fighters in the UFC, definitely one of the most exciting fighters in the lightweight division. And then Max Holloway, a guy who comes to scrap in every fight. 2 of them, some of the most fun fighters in UFC against each other in a title fight. That's going to be a banger. Zhang Weili, one of the, I always say this in every video, but one of the few female fighters that's genuinely interesting. We saw her in her last title fight against Amanda Lemos, and she absolutely dominated her. The same thing to Carla Esparza and Joanna. She just comes and absolutely destroys every female fighter out there, which is why I'm excited to see her against Zhang Xiaonan, because it's not, I can almost guarantee that it's not going to be a boring title fight. So they've done well with, you know, matchmaking Zhang Weili. And then even Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill. Maybe you wanted a bigger fight, maybe you wanted like a super fight on paper, but regardless of what you think, Poatan versus Hill is going to be one of the most interesting fights you can make in the light heavyweight division. It's bound to be an absolutely insane striking match. You've got Jamal Hill, a guy who just essentially sleeps everyone the second his fist connects with their chin. And he's an insane boxer, insane striker, against Alex Pereira, one of the most exciting kickboxers, yet dangerous kickboxers in the entirety of the UFC. So that's going to be an insane fight in the light heavyweight division. So yeah, we're getting 3 title fights, and they're fun title fights as well. There's going to be no snooze fests. They're just going to be pure fun fights, and I can almost guarantee. So yeah, the fact that we've got fun title fights as well is interesting. Then we've got the prelims as well. The prelims are essentially full of main eventers. Normally on like a UFC card, the prelims will be, you know, unranked fighters or just lesser known fighters. I mean, that's the whole point of prelims. This time around, pretty much every single fight on the prelim card could be like a main event for like a normal pay-per-view or a co-main event. I mean, Yuri Prohaska, he's just main evented and he's on the prelims. He just main evented a pay-per-view and now he's on the prelims. Aljamain Sterling, his last fight was a main event for a pay-per-view as well. should probably ignore Holly Holm. Diego Lopez versus Sadiq Youssef, easy fight night main event. Like, it's just full of main eventers. Even the early prelims, you could easily have Davis and Figueiredo and Cody Garbrandt on a fight night card as well. So there's just a lot of main eventers in the prelims. There's not really these unknown ranked fighters. So the fact that there's a lot of well-known names on the prelims, and just on the card as well, there's not really any unknown fighters. Unless you're like a casual and you don't really watch the UFC that often, you pretty much should be familiar with every single fighter on this card. Like, that's how stacked it is. It's just extreme. You should be extremely familiar with most of the fighters on the card. And I don't even think it's just the title fights that are going to be bangers. I think all the fights on this card are going to be a banger. I mean, like I said, Hill and Pereira, Zhang Weili versus Yang Xiaonan, Gaethje and Holloway, but even Charles Oliveira on the card as well against Arman Tsarukyan. That's one of the most intriguing fights in the UFC right now. That's probably most people's main event, because Oliveira versus Tsarukyan's that good. Bo Nickel versus Brundage, I don't think that should be on the main card, but that's probably going to be good. Yuri Prochazka, one of the most entertaining fighters in the UFC. We get to see Sterling move up to heavyweight against a scrapper and Calvin Kattar. We see Kayla Harrison come over to the UFC after being basically a lightweight in PFL. Sadiq Youssef versus Diego Lopez is going to be a banger. Jalin Turner versus Moicano is going to be an absolute scrap based on their last performances. We get to see Jim Miller in there against Bobby Green. Figueiredo and Garbrandt opening up the card as well. What I'm trying to say is all of the fights are bangers. There's no fights that we can really look at and bite our nails wondering if it's going to be a fun fight or not. I can almost guarantee that every fight I've just mentioned is going to be an extremely entertaining fight. And because of that, not only is it stacked, but the fact that it's most likely going to perform as well, I think this has potential to be, not even potential, I think this is going to be the greatest card of all time. And then my final point is the promotion for this card. I mean, obviously they're going to promote it. It's UFC 300. And I have had a few problems with the things like the poster, but overall, the promo for this card has been great. I mean, they started off with a trailer, like a movie trailer for a UFC pay-per-view, and then recently they came out with, like, you know, a UFC 300 promotion where it was like comparing the fighters of nowadays to the fighters of back in the olden days of the UFC. And I feel like that promo for UFC 300 was insane as well. And overall, the promotion side of this card has been great. But I can't wait for this card. I mean, it's stacked on paper. It's the most stacked card of all time. Whether you think it's going to perform or not, you can't doubt that it is the most stacked card of all time. We've never had a card more stacked than UFC 300. And the fact that I feel like a lot of the fights are going to be bangers and a lot of the fights are going to perform. And how many of our favourite fighters are on this card as well? We've got Charles Oliveira on the card, Alex Pereira on the card, Justin Gaethje on the card, Holloway on the card. You know, we've got Davis and Figueiredo and Garbrandt, Yuri Prochazka, Sterling's back. The guy was in a title fight and now he's not even headlining the prelims. Like, this is the level that this pay-per-view's at. You might disagree. You might have wanted a bigger fight for the main event. You might have been expecting a super fight, but even though you might have had your hopes, you know, maybe let down a little bit, it's still the greatest card of all time. And anyone who disagrees, I feel like you're just trying to be different at this point. It's stacked. It's insanely stacked on paper. It's going to perform. And in my opinion, it is the greatest card of all time. So let me know your thoughts on UFC 300 and, you know, what your favourite fight on this card is. I can't wait for pretty much every single fight, even on the main card, like Bo Nickel versus Cody Brundage. A lot of people have hated on that matchup. And even though I don't think it should be on the main card, it's going to be an early finish by Bo Nickel. So overall, I'm a fan of pretty much every fight on this card. It's stacked on paper, and I can't wait. And that is why, in my opinion, UFC 300, greatest card of all time without a doubt. Let me know your thoughts on the card. Thank you for watching.